Thank you to our co-sponsors up next. So this webinar is being co-sponsored by Alliance Magazine, Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, Philanthropy New York, Philanthropy California, and United Philanthropy Forum. We appreciate them for partnering with us on this important and exciting topic. As we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges that it works on the stolen lands of many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural impacts of colonialism and disasters. The erasure of Indigenous knowledge about how to care for these lands has caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonization and white supremacy and their connections to philanthropy today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original peoples and their elders and past, present, and future generations. Okay, so here we go. At the end of the webinar, donors will understand why it's time to stop calling disasters natural, expand their thinking on links between climate change and disasters, and discover why a shift in narrative on disasters can change philanthropic decision-making on when, why, and how to conduct disaster giving. So with that, I am really excited to introduce our special guest. I'm looking forward to an engaging conversation with Dr. Ilan Kelman. Ilan Kelman is a professor of disasters and health at the University College London's Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and Institute for Global Health in London, England. He's also a professor, too, at the University of Agder, Kristiansand, Norway. His overall research interest is linking disasters and health while integrating climate change into both. His three main areas of interest are disaster diplomacy and health diplomacy, island sustainability involving safe and healthy communities in isolated locations, and risk education for health and disasters. Ilan, I am looking forward to talking to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the support and, of course, to CDP for arranging this.
Yeah, I am excited, and I have tons of questions, so get ready.
Let's go for it.
All right. So why don't you start by telling me how you began to understand or think about framing disasters as not natural?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to look at the history, and how I came about it was actually listening to others. The idea is not mine. The hashtags are not mine, much as I would love to claim credit for it. I very much seen what people did and they convinced me. And why? Why is it convincing? I mean, what did I see? It actually came out decades ago. In the 70s, if not much earlier. People even traced it back to the 18th century and earlier, so long before I was in this field. And the fundament is that sometimes we see a huge earthquake, but no disaster. Sometimes you see a moderate earthquake and huge disaster. And it's the same for floods and droughts and tornadoes and volcanic eruptions. So there clearly is not that strong a link or even a correlation between sort of the different ways we measure what nature does, which we often call hazards, and then the actual outcome, which we'll look at as being disasters. So if sometimes there's a massive storm, but no disasters, and sometimes there's, just a regular storm and a huge disaster, it's not that hazard, it's not the storm. So what is it? And that's where the people have taught me that it's lack of options, lack of resources, lack of opportunities. We know how to build infrastructure to withstand tornadoes and earthquakes. Some places do, some don't. So it's really vulnerability where people are forced to live, how they're forced to live, what options they have to look at where they live, their jobs and money coming in, that determines whether or not they can deal with nature. So the disaster is not coming from nature, so it's not natural.
Yeah, I really like your concept of talking about sort of hazards and vulnerabilities, right? And so what you're really talking about there is this is a challenge of infrastructure issues and how we've set up people to be in spaces where they're set up to be challenged or for something natural to happen to impact them, right? So how do we get people to stop talking about all of this as sort of just it's a natural disaster and move into the language of vulnerabilities and hazards and those sorts of things.
Well, I hope that this is one example of it, and I'd encourage people to follow the hashtags no natural disasters and disasters are not natural. One of the leaders in this field has set up the website nonaturaldisasters.com. So that's simply one word, nonaturaldisasters.com. And that's really for the public, for the media. But some people will quite rightly say, well, anyone can set up a website. Anyone can create a hashtag. So if you want the science, contact me. Look at it. Again, there are decades of publications on this, from sort of the usual thick academic books to very thin papers, slim papers. And it's really just talk to us, communicate, give some examples, and say, does this make sense? Is this working for you? If not, maybe we can adjust what we're talking about. But it's really, there's a lot of sort of pithy lines. There's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. Not everyone can afford to
Yeah.
have good clothing. Earthquakes don't kill people. Collapsing infrastructure does. And it's people with power and resources that make the choice about whether to build earthquake-resistant infrastructure in zones with earthquakes. And if you're poor, you don't have a lot of choice. Who can hire a surveyor? Who can say, oh, well, I know that this is a dangerous building, so please retrofit it. Of course, people don't have those choices. So it's a whole group saying, I'm going to force that disaster on others. And I hope that this evidence and this approach is what will convince people to not only avoid the phrase natural disaster, but to support the idea disasters are not natural.
Yeah. And I think something really powerful there is oftentimes we'll talk about these events in a vacuum, right? And which is what you're really talking about is there are a lot of factors that go into people being in situations where they're significantly impacted. And it's many different things, not one system operating at the same time, operating by itself, but several systems operating.
I
You've
mean,
got
that,
yeah, go
yeah.
ahead. Yeah,
No, I
please.
mean, that's a brilliant way of expressing it. And so that's why we say no disasters happen quickly. All disasters happen slowly. It takes a long time with all the systems you mentioned to build a city in an earthquake zone without earthquake resistance. It
Yeah.
takes a long time to force people to live in a floodplain without having options to retrofit, to ensure their possessions are protected from floods, or to get warning and evacuate. So it's exactly what you said. And these are the systems that we ought to challenge to reduce the risk of disasters.
Yeah, and we're talking about challenging systems. You've got a hashtag, which means it's on trend. And that means at least somebody is picking it up, probably the age of my 14-year-old, at least as a start, which is good. And like, how is the idea of hashtag no new natural disasters taking off? Like, who is adopting it and how are you seeing it be adopted in the broader world?
It seems to be a lot of people are coming on board, researchers, government workers, the for-profit sector, the not-for-profit sector, because when we sit down and work with them and explain it to them, it just makes sense. And sometimes they have good objections, and that's how we can sort of hone our message, that we can adjust it. At some of the international levels, UNDRR, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, has been one of the most amazing promoters
Hmm.
of this message. They've put out videos, they've put out short excerpts, they let us blog for them, they promote it, and the heads of UNDRR use a hashtag and talk about it all the time. Another UN agency, WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, so far has been a bit more hesitant, but it's about dialogue. It's understanding why they do object, and it's not criticizing, because people have understandable concerns, but we hope that we can get there. I mean, I was even recently told by a researcher, why are you promoting this? Because everyone understands, everyone accepts it. But actually, people who use a hashtag do get a bit of backlash. You know, it's always a standard question. Well, what about meteorite strikes? What about comets and asteroids? Well, we know how to monitor outer space. We know exactly the possible options to try to respond to a threat. And we're sort of monitoring outer space, but not that well. And we have no mechanism to respond if there is a major threat. So it just requires a tiny nudge, which is the difference between that object just missing Earth or hitting a city and creating a global cataclysm. And yet we're not making the choices to avoid that. So yes, even objects from outer space, they are not natural disasters.
Yeah, well, It strikes me that what you're really talking about is risk mitigation, right? Like you're talking about, um, you know, risk that has likelihood versus risk that doesn't have likelihood. Meteorites, I'm sure, are possible. I'm not a scientist, so I don't want to claim to be. But you're talking about the infrastructure and the reality that these are challenges we're going to see. You also talked about how, like you mentioned, meteorology and how this is going to get dicey. Let's talk a little bit about sort of the intersections with climate change here, right? Like we keep hearing climate change is increasing temperatures and causing disasters to be more frequent and intense. Like, what's the link between no natural disasters, infrastructure, and climate change?
And the key is what you just mentioned. It's actually the rising temperature. We are seeing heat waves. We are seeing temperatures with humidity that modern humanity has never encountered. And so it's actually, sadly, fairly easy to attribute a certain percentage of heat wave deaths to human-caused climate change. That calculation has errors, but it's very straightforward, and the numbers are going up. So heat waves, when we've never experienced that before, and there's really no options, particularly for outdoor workers, who of course tend to be the lowest paid and they are the most vulnerable, like agriculture, construction, delivery, people who collect the garbage, they're either dead or they lose their livelihood, at least for that day. And there's no doubt those deaths, that disaster, direct link to human-caused climate change. The challenge we're finding is any weather event, in fact, almost any hazard, is often immediately attributed to human-caused climate change.
Mm.
After the 2011 tsunami, I mean, in Japan, the number of tweets I saw is huge catastrophe. This is what we're seeing because of climate change. And that's just not scientifically defensible. Same with Hurricane Beryl, which just ripped through the Caribbean. A lot of what the media wanted me to say was, this is climate change. This is what it is. But we're in hurricane season. They're in Hurricane Alley. They should expect a hurricane. And the response is, well, we've never seen a Category 5 at this time of year. Well, okay, but if you're not ready for a Category 5 in September, then you're simply not ready for hurricanes.
Mm.
Because if you are ready for a Category 5 in September, then you should be ready for a Category 5 in June or July. So there's almost no doubt that the intensity of Hurricane Beryl and Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Harvey, almost no doubt that they were stronger because of human-caused climate change. There's also no doubt that the disaster happened. These people simply weren't ready for it. Now, to be fair to the Caribbean, when we compare the destruction in close places, not exactly the same, but close places from Hurricane Ivan in 2004, they actually did phenomenally well in Hurricane Beryl 20 years later in 2024, which shows even in a Category 5, although not Category 5 landfall everywhere, that even with a climate change fueled hurricane, they can still save lives and avoid a huge disaster. It was, a different level of disaster. So let's do better. Let's say, even if the recent paper came out talking about Category 6 hurricanes, even if it's Category 6, we know how to warn, we know how to evacuate, we know how to ensure infrastructure stays up and people can return to their livelihoods. And yes, climate change, human-caused climate change, is intensifying these hurricanes far more quickly. When Acapulco was hit, that ramped up within 24 hours, phenomenally quick, linked to human-caused climate change. Hurricanes are tending to form closer to continental landmasses. Then be ready for them. We know how to deal with hurricanes. Let's do it.
Yeah, I think what's really powerful about what you're talking about is the fact that this is all predictable, right? Like the predictability matters. Like and it's to your point, it's not like hurricanes are new. Um, how do we get people to start thinking about this as a long-term journey and long-term preparation versus just sort of our natural instinct to run towards sort of a reactive moment in time where something happened and we must respond? Like, how do we shift that mindset?
It has to come from the people who have the power, opportunities, and resources. It's so easy for us to say that, whether it's a storm or a drought or a landslide or an earthquake, all you need is to be able to be in your home for 2 weeks without outside assistance, right? Food, non-perishable food, potable water, medications and hygiene need, first aid kit, know how to use it, and then either wind up her battery-operated flashlight and radio, and then spare batteries, That's the advice, at least 2 weeks. In the UK, in the US, in many other countries, far too many people cannot put enough food on the table every day. How dare we go to them and say, all you need is to be ready for 2 weeks? So it's just not viable to say, well, check your structure for flood resistance and earthquake resistance and wind resistance. People can't do that. So it has to come from people with power, opportunities, and resources saying, we don't want people to die in perfectly typical environmental events and processes. Therefore, we're going to ensure that people have the options, the resources, and the political power to help themselves, their families, their neighbors, and those around them.
Yeah, I think, look, I'm a funder, and so I'm thinking about what you said in terms of where and how should I utilize the funds that I have in my budget for disaster? Like, where should I be thinking about utilizing those funds? What moments in time? What mechanisms? Give me a toolbox for how I should be thinking about how to do this.
The moment is now. This is long term. So we have to start now. And then it's a balance between the fact that we know that so many people cannot be ready. And so there are going to be disasters, and it is a matter of life and death if you help them immediately. It's a balance between that and also helping them now to ensure that they don't need that relief aid afterwards. And we hope to switch it so that the more we help them now prepare, the less will actually be dependent on the life-saving money that you and others can give afterwards. So where's your toolbox? Well, number one is actually look at how best to help those who cannot help themselves, to ensure they can help themselves. But number two, again, don't negate the fact that some people, it is life and death after a perfectly typical drought or tornado. And then number three, see how we can all work together with knowledge, skills, and support to make best use of the limited funds. We know that a small investment in mitigating or reducing disaster risk has almost immediate payback in terms of lives and livelihoods and lifestyles, and then long-term payback in terms of not having a disaster. If you need that evidence, we have it and we can work together to improve it. If you want to say, well, we only have limited funds, how else can we help? Again, it's about a collaboration. I mean, I'm an expert, well, whatever that means, as much as you are, but the real experts are the people affected. So let's work with them. But does that message suit you? I mean, does that make sense to you? Or is it just, well, we just give money and there's nothing else? I mean, what do you need in order to try and in terms of acting?
Well, so I really love that question, and I love your sort of focus on collaboration, right? What we found in our work, when I think about it as a funder in disaster, is oftentimes when we need to respond to an individualized crisis event, the fact that we've built infrastructure and relationships in advance actually allows us to respond even faster, better, frankly, because we know who to call and we trust each other and we know some of the gaps in infrastructure. Because to your point, this is a long game. So you're not going to solve all or prevent all or mitigate all risks. But the fact that you have built these relationships and had conversations around infrastructure challenges means when an event happens, you know what to do, you know how big the event could be. You can use it as a catalyst to make sure it doesn't happen again, right? Like it gives you that step forward. So you are working towards this in a long game versus like a short game, right? I think,
I love that idea
yeah.
of a catalyst, a step forward. And so you feel that we can push you to pivot less after and more before, and not just financing, but the networks you talked about.
Exactly. Well, and I think it's really important for funders to talk about infrastructure, right? Like oftentimes, um, your hashtag no natural disasters is really an infrastructure call. It's to say, like, we have to invest in people and communities on the front end, right? Like, we have to prevent. And if we think about it in terms of having strong infrastructure, I always think about it. I'm a Midwesterner who grew up next to a trailer park that ultimately we had a tornado one day, and all of my neighbors who had trailers, their homes were destroyed and we lived in a little brick apartment and we were fine, right? Like that's not a huge deal, but it tells you prepared infrastructure is a difference for people, right? Like it matters. So I'm a funder. You're an expert. You used air quotes, but it's not really true. You're a legit expert. You've got a lot of titles. I like it. how do you recommend we think about investing in local organizations to support these other components, whether it's preparedness, whether it's long-term recovery, whether it's general infrastructure? How do we build those collaborations? How do we make sure that we're being good, thoughtful partners and that we're listening to community, um, and acknowledging sort of the power you talked about?
Yeah, that is a challenge. And a lot of it is going to come down to credibility.
Mm,
How to determine that? How are we certain that people who are being affected do trust those groups? Who is always left out? The hardest to reach people, those who are marginalized. And, we develop lists, right? Prisoners, people without homes, homeless people, often people with certain disabilities, sex workers, undocumented people, sometimes youth who've run away from home. So are we certain that we've captured all these people?
mm,
Are we certain that they are on board? What we do know is that in many countries, although not all, the number of dedicated, knowledgeable, wise people who are working on the ground with those most affected, they are there and they are the experts. So it's finding them and it's ensuring again that they are credible, that they're not going to run away with money or they're not excluding a group. And then the challenge, of course, is what about countries where doing that sort of work will get you executed? How do we actually enter that? How do we break into that? And those are the unanswered questions. We are working on it. We're hoping that science contributes to that, but science alone is not going to do it, which is why, again, we have our networks with you, with governments, with international organizations, and then others for profit and not for profit. But yeah, there's a huge amount of work to do. We know our own limitations, and we're using the evidence that we've accumulated over decades, but we are still looking for more evidence, particularly for groups that even we didn't realize are generally excluded, and also learning lessons for where it appeared someone or a group was trustworthy and credible. And then unfortunately, in the end, it turned out not to be. So look, we're dealing with human beings. They are complicated. Well, I'm a human being too, so I'm complicated. And it's really about saying, how can we recognize our mistakes, do better, and above all, learn from them and certainly try to avoid doing more harm than good.
yeah, I think it's really important that we actually see the people we're talking to these topics about as complex individuals with complicated needs and objectives, and not sort of just people who just don't believe the thing that you believe, or are adversely opposed. So if I really like hashtag no natural disasters and I'm really interested in it, what should I be doing to get these messages to resonate with other people? Like, how are you getting people to resonate? What's pulling through to people who don't quite get it, or who just don't know anything about it, or who have an automatic aversion to hashtags, which sometimes
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just the hashtag. It's sitting down under the palm tree with the people affected.
Mm,
It's also spending time in a university classroom with 10 or 100 students who have paid a ridiculous amount of money for education in order to instill the ideas in them. One person cannot do everything. You're doing amazing work. We hope at University College London, we're doing okay work, and we have the country's first bachelor degree, undergraduate degree in global humanitarian studies. We run several master's programs, and every student that I teach learns this phrase, disasters are not natural. Sometimes it's hashtag, sometimes it's not. I mean, we try in different languages. We blog, we write scientific papers, we write books, and we bring it to the classroom. And we're now seeing that some of our students have high-level positions in government,
mm.
in the United Nations, in the not-for-profit and private sectors, and they're starting to bring that message there. So it's just, one or two departments that I'm in, and one university, in one city, in one country, but you're another individual. And there are others on this call. And again, keep in mind, these are not my ideas. It's not my hashtag. It came from others and I've learned. So I hope to continue pushing this down and then others filter out. We have come a long way from the first academic works in the 1970s, I mean, ancient history of the 1970s, saying don't use this phrase. We've come a long way to actually having a hashtag and having it in the classroom. So it's about all of us working together to ripple out and get it there. Uh, that's what I do. What do you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we keep talking about it, right? We listen, as you said, to people, and sometimes we meet them where they're at in terms of the language, right? And say, well, give me an example of an instance where you could have seen that if something had been better, this wouldn't have been as bad, right? And I think oftentimes giving people examples, like the story I told earlier, all of the amazing stories that you just told, really sort of gets people to personalize it, because back to your point, like we're all just humans. And sometimes you need both the data, right? But you also need the stories to compel people to understand how is this actually happening. So I think we have to keep talking about it. We also just have to keep sharing, and we have to keep asking people in different ways about the ways in which they think prevention of these crises can impact us all and make it better. I
And
am
that
self,
also other
yeah,
languages. Yeah, that means also other languages. Disastrous,
exactly.
not lateralis, and ensuring that we are getting the vocabulary correct, but also culturally correct, not just words correct. And so it's sitting down with people. What is working for you? What isn't? How can I change? Tell me to improve.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And also, uh, as experts, not claiming that we know everything, I really appreciate your fact that like there are gaps in the science and we're all still learning and we're all collaboratively learning together. So just creating these conversation spaces for that learning really allows us all to acknowledge what we don't know and do know, and that we can all come to solutions that ultimately impact people. I have a selfish question for you, which is that you have sort of divided your time. You've got a part on global health, which I do work in the space of health, and on risk and disaster reduction. Can you talk to me about sort of how that worked together and how it works together in this space? Because I think it's really interesting to think about those intersections, in particular in global health. And frankly, global health gets a lot more energy and conversation around it than your risk and disaster space. So I'd love to know how those two intersect and how you think about those conversations collectively.
So it was wonderful creativity within leaders at University College London who brought together these two departments, global health, risk and disaster reduction, and created the 50-50 appointment. And when I saw advertised, I thought that is so amazing, so unique, so creative. I had to go for it. And it's actually what brought me to London. So my mandate is to connect the two. And we do it through different bridges. Absolutely. Climate change is one bridge. Immense health impacts. And it does affect hazards as well as leading to these heat wave disasters. So we have to ensure the science is correct and ensure that those most affected are able to help themselves and help others, irrespective of how the climate is changing. Other connectors are migration
Mm,
and diplomacy. So there is sadly a lot of conflict, a lot of wars going on. That does undermine people's abilities to deal with the environment. Does disaster diplomacy help bring them together by learning lessons from health diplomacy and medical diplomacy? A couple of specific projects. One is called Disasters Avoided. And the idea is to say that when a huge disaster happens, it hits the headlines. But when a disaster doesn't happen, do people know?
hmm,
Do they care? So
yeah.
how do we evidence and publicize a disaster that did not happen because people took action? And we have many examples now. We're working on it through disastersavoided.com. So that's one word, disastersavoided.com. That sort of big picture saying, well, what are the numbers? What are the actual scientific evidence that we can then try and communicate to policymakers and the public? But a lot of it also comes from people. So another project in which I've been so privileged to be involved is called Land Body Ecologies. So that's one word, landbodyecologies.com, landbodyecologies.com. And it's about working with Indigenous land-based peoples around the world to understand what they are experiencing. The land trauma, the social trauma, the changes undermining everything they've known, and what assistance they need and what assistance they can provide. So it's all these multiple directions. And it's saying that mental health and well-being, of course, is as important as physical health and well-being, environmental health and well-being, spiritual health and well-being, and they're all interconnected. So does making those connections does that very much assist people in dealing with the different traumas and anxieties they're experiencing, and then turning that around and saying, well, what do they have? What do they need? And can we get it to them to ensure that trauma becomes realistic hope and anxiety becomes inspiration? So rather than them just saying, well, the rich people are changing the climate, there's nothing we can do about it. Instead, they can still avoid disasters. They can still be connected to their land, their knowledge, and their wisdom to try to get through the very rough environmental and social changes that are imposed from outside and that are affecting us all.
First of all, I think you should write hashtags. I think you had a lot of really beautiful, insightful statements in there. And I really love the sort of centering in people who are impacted part of what you're talking about is centering the right people in the conversation. And I'll also say, as a person who operates in the funder space, I love your concept of disasters avoided because I think one of the things we always struggle with is metrics, right? Like, how do we measure the thing that didn't happen? So I think having a space and a tool where you're really evaluating what didn't happen, I think is very, very effective because to your point, people are reactionary as humans. And so we like to measure what we can react to versus measuring what we proactively avoided. So I think just the thoughtfulness around that, personally, I greatly appreciate. Um,
Fine. And what's best for you? I mean, do you like benefit cost analyses to say prevention is cheaper than cure? Do you
yeah.
like deaths avoided to say prevention is better than cure or saves lives? I mean, what metric suits you best?
Yeah, I think it depends on the day, being really honest, but I think certainly we're all looking at return on investment one way or the other, right? Like that's a reality of the work. And then I think another thing that I think we often lose in these conversations, but is really, really important when we measure what impact is and how we've done something or avoided something, is does the community that you were serving feel impacted, right? Like we often will measure like we avoided this number of things, but people, if people don't feel like the infrastructure is there that didn't exist before, or if they feel like they're still as vulnerable as they were before, how much impact did you really have? So I think we've got to have these quantitative measures around the success of initiatives, but we also have to have sort of these qualitative metrics, to your point about power sharing on the front end. Like that is actually an important part of this entire dialogue. Yeah. So enough about me, my questions, because I'm just hogging you. I would, which I will do forever, and maybe this call will end in 3 hours for us, but everybody else gets to get off at an hour, so don't worry. We've received a lot of questions, both in advance and in the chat, which is a good sign. I think it means that people love you. So we're going to start by working through the list of questions we got in advance, and then we're going to go through some of the ones that are in the question and answer box. As a reminder, our webinars aim to provide education for the philanthropic community. So while we are welcome to pose a question, we will focus first on those addressing funder issues. That's why I'm here. I'm a funder and I'm interested in learning. So I'm going to read a few of the questions that we got, and then I'm going to go through the chat. I can see we've got a lot of questions, so we're not going to get through them all, but we're going to try our best to prioritize the ones that we think we can make it through in the time frame. So let's start with the basics, or non-basics. So how can we convince all the stakeholders that disasters are the result of vulnerabilities, social and physical? How do we change the narrative?
If only we knew how to do that. We have done it. I mean, we sort of collectively, not me personally necessarily, like I said, with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and many academics. It has taken a while, so can we accelerate that? And I guess, as you just said, some people love the numbers. So there's this wonderful ratio, which is often attributed to the World Bank, saying that for every dollar or euro invested in disaster risk reduction or risk mitigation, depending on the source, either 4 or 7 is saved.
Hmm.
We tried to trace that back and tried to show it, and we actually found that that 4-to-1, 7-to-1 ratio was basically bogus. Because the ratio is usually far, far better. And
Wow.
so we came up with the list to show over different time frames and very specific, often highly local examples to show that sometimes ratios were getting into double digits, like 10-to-1, 16-to-1. And again, some people respond and say, prevention is cheaper than cure. I'm investing. It's also linking to beyond the disaster, because it's not just the disaster avoided. It's also, if I invest in you now, what do you gain immediately, and is there that payback?
Yeah.
And that's where, supported by Red Cross, Red Crescent, we did some very specific work in Bangladesh to show that immediate payback in livelihoods, which then came in the longer term payback when a cyclone went through. But others will say, you know what, these anecdotes, just talk to me, give me the overarching picture, the global picture, and that's fine. That's where we can talk about hazard and vulnerability and how they come together for risk, and how hazard doesn't link to risk as much as vulnerability, and that's more conceptual. And if that works, that's fine. So it's the usual rule in communication, right?
Yeah.
Your audience and understand what your audience wants. As you said, some people absolutely love hashtags, and they're on X and they're on Instagram and they're following it and going through it. Others may not even have a smartphone. Shocking as that may seem, not everyone is fully connected. Great, let's sit down and talk eyeball to eyeball.
Well, and I think it's lovely, frankly, that you have the different tools and options for people. I think that's the most powerful thing is it's not just a hashtag. You can go and pull all of the different mechanisms that might work with your different stakeholders, right? So like that infrastructure exists for people. So if you're interested in convincing people, to your point, none of this is new. What's really happened is there's been a centralization of the information and data in one place to make it a little bit easier for people to find the message that resonates with the audience that they're most interested in talking to, right? Which is great because we're in a world where efficiency matters. So we've talked about some topics that are easy and hard and complicated. And I don't think we can ignore politics in all of this. I sit in the US and we have a complicated political climate. So, how do we talk about unnatural disasters? How do we talk about climate change at this moment in time in the places we sit, given the political ramifications of all of this?
Yeah, and it's not just the US. I mean, Canada's expected next prime minister is not especially enamored with dealing with climate change either. And of course, prior to the current one, it was Stephen Harper who actually withdrew from one of the international climate change agreements. So how do we talk about it? Again, it's hard. There's two levels. Number one, meeting the people in a way that they will respond to. But number two, never compromising reality or the science. So personally, I'm not afraid to talk about human-caused climate change. It's a huge issue. We should not be doing it, and we know how to stop. On the other hand, if someone comes to me and says, Ilan, don't do that because you're just going to turn off the audience, then it's okay. But I can actually focus on actions, and actions which have to be done irrespective of climate change. So a specific example, one of the ways to try and stop human-caused climate change is to substantially reduce our fossil fuel use, stop burning fossil fuels. But when people say, oh, climate change, stop fossil fuels, as you're saying, that's hard in the US and potentially in Canada next year, as well as Australia. On the other hand, do you want cleaner air? Do you like your kids having asthma and coughing all the time? Well, if you want cleaner air, reduce fossil fuel use. No dispute. Oh, and by the way, do you want lower taxes? Because fossil fuels, the industry is subsidized phenomenally. We're talking a minimum of around $400 billion or euros a year in direct subsidies from our governments, our taxes to fossil fuel companies. Why should I be subsidizing a rich CEO? So if you want lower taxes, invest in energy approaches which don't require as many subsidies. And that's only the direct subsidies. When people try calculations for indirect, it's about 10 times that amount. Imagine $4 trillion or euros a year going to support fossil fuels. So I can sit down with people and say, you want lower taxes, you want better health and cleaner air, reduce fossil fuel use. And I haven't even mentioned climate change. And every single other action to try and deal with human-caused climate change, both stopping it and the impacts, actually have non-climate change reasons for enacting. So we can just bypass or circumvent it and sit down with people and say, okay, you're not accepting the science of climate change, but let's talk about actions. And hopefully that will work. Hopefully there will be responses, and it's a way of bringing people on board. To me, it's still a challenge not to bring in human-caused climate change. But if we get the right actions and we're saving lives and saving money, we're not lying. Everything is correct. So why not do it?
Yeah, it strikes me there's a consistent theme around communicating where people are at, right?
Mm.
And finding sort of commonalities in the things that people agree that they value, and then presenting evidence around those things that are common values. And I think that's true in all philanthropy, honestly, regardless of the subject. And we have to pull the same levers in this space as we do anywhere else, which is to find ways to collaborate and convene and have conversations that can sometimes be tricky, but are steeped in the things we all agree on, right? We never get to perfect,
No. And
but
my baseline is I'm not going to lie. The science has to be correct. I really want evidence-informed, evidence-based policy and action. But science does change, knowledge changes, and my views have shifted. So people will say, well, 340 years ago, Ilan, you said this, and now you're saying that. Say, yeah, because knowledge changed. And it's having the courage to accept that change, to being true to ourselves and true to others, to ensure that what we're doing is absolutely communicating to people on their own terms in their own ways, but still having the integrity to, number one, be accurate, but to change what we say when our knowledge improves. And that's also the excitement of science. We are always learning. We are always changing, hopefully for the better.
yeah, I think that forward growth movement and mindset is always a positive thing about the fact that we can always grow and learn. And I think you've given a lot of really good examples around sort of what a vulnerability is and how they show up. Um, but we've got several questions which are about like, how do we address this in very specific sectors? So I'm kind of gonna bullet point your sectors and let you go forth on like, tell me a little bit about like, if you're in this space, how would you do this? So let's say you're in the aid sector and you're doing things that are in the global aid sector. Like, how do we get this narrative shift to happen for aid giving, right?
Yeah, it's hard because often the funding is earmarked or ring-fenced and it cannot change. So if it's possible to alter that structure, that would help. Otherwise, there's a couple of approaches which have been implemented and seem to be successful. Number one is as soon as aid and relief is being given, it has to be targeted on that long-term investment. And it's not a trade-off because helping people immediately, rebuilding that day-to-day, week-to-week connects directly to the decade to decade. And we not only have that in academic theory, we have that in practice where people have been doing it, which actually leads to the second point, which is a lot more practical. And reframing it, it's looking at it as a process. So people have said from the 1970s, again, this goes way, way back, that post-disaster shelter, post-disaster housing is not a product. It's not about just giving four walls and a roof with windows and doors, because that's the end product. Rather, it's a process of creating home, creating a home, creating home. It's a process of ensuring that people feel secure and safe in their rebuilt shelter or rebuilt house.
Hmm.
It's that process of constructing community and services. Because even when you have your four walls and a roof, you need water, you need electricity, you need sewage, and you need locks on your doors and on your windows. So whether we're in the aid sector for shelter or for water or for health or for all the other clusters, all the other things which of course keep us alive, it's that long-term process. To be saying, yes, we're flying in, we're putting up the tents, we're immediately saving lives day to day, but we're still thinking decades down. And again, none of this is mine, none of this is new. This comes from decades ago to realize how much poorly directed and poorly implemented aid creates the next disaster, to pivot away from that, to ensure that aid now supports people to avoid aid in the future.
Yeah, I think your theme around prevention, I think, is really resonating and is pulling through that if we are thinking about the long game, we do more for people by preventing than we ever will by just reacting. And I
But
think,
it's hard for the aid sector. I mean, I've talked to
yeah,
agencies who say, look, my mandate is shelter, I can't do housing. And others say, well, my mandate is housing, I can't do shelter. And I'm trying to think in other languages, what's even the difference between those two? But when the structure is that way, that's really what we have to change, because those people are committed. They want to do what's right. They're not allowed to.
yeah, and I think we see that show up in a lot of places, and I think I see that in some of the questions we're getting, which is like, let's say I am a funder for a very small or mid-sized local community, right? Like I support a very localized environment. I'm selfishly in the US, so maybe in the US. Like, how do I get people to pay it? What should I be doing different than the advice that you gave for aid organizations who have a lot of earmarked governmental funds that come with the work?
It's so contextual.
Yeah.
And that's where that organization and that individual in the organization will know. I mean, I'm sure people were cringing at my horrible Spanish accent earlier. And so if people want to trust someone who is fluent in Spanish and actually sounds it, then I'm not the right person to do it. So it's understanding who people respond to, who is credible, who is trustworthy, while also not undermining other aspects. Because we know that there are groups who will say, well, I'm not going to listen to a woman, or I'm not going to listen to a man. And that's just sexist. And if we're not going to accept women and men, if we're not going to accept males, females, and other genders, then we're actually creating vulnerabilities in the long term. And we get trapped in this all the time, right? Saying both genders. But it's not just two. If people do not accept that baseline, it is definitely a struggle to help everyone in the long term. So it's always that balance between saying, yes, it's contextual, it's local. So you from that small organization, or you and that individual, you tell me what you need and how to communicate. But if people suddenly say, well, I'm not dealing with that group because they're bad people, and it's based on, certain characteristics, then we have to find a way around that. And I haven't succeeded. Again, there are so many examples where there was a major catastrophe, the international aid business leapt into action, was saving lives every day. And one person said, why are you helping them?
Hmm.
They don't deserve aid. We have to overcome those basic biases and prejudices while still helping people. And the answers are very, very tough. It's difficult conversations, it's difficult actions. And I really feel for the aid workers who are on the ground, absolutely exhausted, risking their own lives. And they have to explain why they're giving food to everyone.
I think a lot of trust building and on the groundwork is required sometimes of us as funders, right? It's kind of challenging, and I think that's what you're really highlighting is this need to build relationships and trust, and then the conversation gets a little bit easier, right? If we inherently trust each other, it certainly helps the conversation.
We certainly hope, and again, it's long term. So can we give the process of giving, or can we make the process of giving food to everyone a start to bring opposing sectors in a location together?
Yeah.
Is a start of dialogue to avoid the conflicts of the past. There aren't a lot of successes, but there are some to learn from, and there are pathways that we often have not used before.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just because we haven't succeeded at it before doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying. Um, we're getting several questions around sort of like how to talk about this work. So, for example, how do we get people to stop saying natural disaster? How do we define the difference between a natural and sort of a non-natural disaster? So the example in the chat is sort of like hurricanes fit in the bucket we naturally think is natural, but like a bombing would be considered unnatural. Give us some terminology tips on like what language should we be using? How should we be referring to natural disasters? How should we be referring to things that are fully man made in the immediate sense versus on a longer spectrum? Give us some tips on how we should be talking about this work.
For me, they're just all disasters, and they all come from the same baseline, vulnerabilities. And of course, we have to define that. We can go into that, but it's fundamentally people don't have choices. They don't have the options, they don't have the resources, they don't have the political power. So they often know what they should be doing. They often know what they could be doing, but they can't deal with that hurricane. it's a disaster. And same with terrorism, same with those who perpetuate violence. There are reasons for it. It really comes from the same issues of feeling powerless, of powerlessness, of feeling that there's no other option, of lack of resources, and to try and address those baseline vulnerabilities, to actually instill the values that killing someone in a bomb is horrific and unacceptable, in the same way that killing someone in a hurricane is horrific and unacceptable. Then we start thinking about the wide gamut and we start linking them. So it's very clear, generally, to identify someone who planted a bomb and they deserve to be criminally charged, and if convicted in hopefully fair justice system, to be punished. How do we actually apply the same standards to those who made decisions that killed someone in a hurricane? Litigation is starting. Those who are dealing with climate change litigation are starting to have successes. There are also examples of people legally trying to say that a leader could have moved people out of a known danger zone, whether it was an avalanche or flood. They didn't. There was a disaster, and therefore they have some sort of criminal or legal culpability. So when it comes to legalities, it's contextual because it depends on the law. Depends how the law is written and how that law can be followed. But still, to change the vocabulary to bring those all together, it's recognizing the same baseline causes, the same outcomes, and fundamentally keep the language simple. They are all disasters.
I like that. I also like simple. And I like the shift towards vulnerabilities. It really centers it in humans versus um, widgets, and it also highlights systems, right? I think that's a really good point. Um, you are a deeply optimistic person, and there's a question in here that I really like, which is like, how do we combat or address issues like disaster fatigue, compassion fatigue, hopelessness? We've talked a lot about like sort of the obstacles that we see in this space, right? And we've talked a lot about sort of the reactionary component of it. How do we address that? Most of the energy of the people who do this work day in, day out is really focused on the reactive, and get us to start taking our energy and putting it other places, both for the nonprofits that we might fund and for us as funders.
But for me, I try to be realistic and I try to be evidence-based. When I am, or when I hope I am, then I find so many success stories. Bangladesh, just before it had independence in 1971, in 1970, a cyclone ripped through it, killed up to 500,000 people. In the past 5 years, there's been a handful of major cyclones ripping through Bangladesh. Deaths have been in the dozens, maybe up to the hundreds, but generally reported as the dozens. It's still a disaster. It's still not good, but it's so much better than hundreds of thousands being killed. So Bangladesh is a success story. Unfortunately, they haven't done as well in terms of preparing for earthquakes. And so sadly, kind of looking at Dhaka, the capital, as potentially being the first known million-death earthquake in human history. So it shows the choices. They've made a positive choice for cyclones, not so much for earthquakes. Same with Japan. We all know the story, 11th March 2011, one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded in human history. And so buildings, high buildings in Tokyo were hundreds of kilometers away, were swaying back and forth because they were designed to do that. If they weren't designed to deal with big earthquakes, they would have collapsed, killing thousands. So instead, people got seasick, but there weren't really a lot of deaths from this enormous, massive earthquake. Super successful news story, super successful research story for Japan on earthquakes, but they hadn't invested in dealing with tsunamis. So over 15,000, perhaps as many as 20,000 people died. And of course, we had a major nuclear power plant catastrophe, which could have been so much worse if brave individuals had not risked their own lives to try and solve those problems and stop a full reactor meltdown. So Japan did super well for earthquakes, not so well for tsunamis. It's this balance of the realism and the evidence to say we can do it. Not only we can do it, we have done it. So how can we continue pushing these successes? The number of cities and towns across the US and Canada that have removed houses from the floodplains and treated the owners well, and then a major storm came through, there was a huge flood, but no flood disaster. there's a success. Of course, those places in the US and Canada, still, some of them still experience flood disasters, some of them might in the future. So it's that realism, it's that evidence to show so much has been done in these places, so many lives saved, so much disruption averted, but there's still another way to go. It's hard because we see the headlines of disasters, but we don't see the headlines of disasters that did not happen. So again, it's more about saying, never deny the challenges, never deny the horrible suffering which is preventable, but also never deny the suffering that was prevented, the disasters that were avoided, the disaster risk that has been reduced, the vulnerabilities that have been overcome.
I have no idea how to close out any better than that. It's a celebration of the work that's been done, a reminder that it's doable and accomplishable, and a charge to move forward. And I, for one, thank you for your inspiration around that work, and how you are motivating all of us to do something different. So, as we come to a close, I want to share a couple of steps. So, what are the next steps for you as funders? The first is modify your language. Making a shift in language can be difficult, but practice makes perfect, as they say. When you read natural disaster on a website or article, correct it in your head. Think disaster. Instead of natural disasters, you can just say disasters or environmental disaster. CDP often says disasters caused by natural hazards or severe weather. Once you get it down, start educating others. Two, educate yourself about climate change and disasters. What we know about climate change and disasters is constantly changing. New information about prevention or mitigation and adaptation is always being released. Stay on top of it, especially about how recovery could bring about better outcomes and prevention. Three, build relationships with marginalized communities. We are often have a recommendation like this, but it is so, so important, as you just heard. When you're not from a specific community, you may not know where to turn. In the US, you can use 211 to learn more about resources and organizations. Reach out to faith groups and cultural leaders and ask coworkers and friends for contacts. Doing this before a disaster will be easier than trying to cold call during the disaster. So, expert resources. CDP provides numerous resources to assist you in planning disaster grant making. We have a monthly newsletter full of information and regular blogs, including our weekly What We're Watching blog that highlights disasters worldwide. CDP's staff team is always available to provide guidance, and if you need more in depth assistance, we also provide various consulting services. You can find more about our work at disasterphilanthropy.org. So next month, we will be looking at feminist humanitarian response on August 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Um, and with that, I'm going to close in order to respect everyone's time and keep it to an hour. That's all the time we have. I want to thank you again to our co-sponsors and to Ilan for taking the time to share his insights with us. Please take a moment to complete our post-webinar survey to let us know what you liked and what you would like to see in future webinars. It will pop up automatically when you exit the webinar. If you have questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to tanya.gulliver-garcia at disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you and have a great afternoon.